Hello everyone and welcome to the third and last part of the mini-series Russia is Not Great. This is a series in response to common mythologies that have caught subroots with way too many people who don't speak Russian, don't know much about Russia and take their information from RT, Sputnik and other Kremlin-founded outlets who tend to say one thing in Russian and a whole different thing in English. Old habits die hard at the Kremlin and the propaganda department continues, to this day, to work tirelessly. So without further ado, let us begin. Chapter 3: Societal Degeneracy. Many social conservatives have recently been willing to look the other way when it comes to Russian dirt because of Russia's two main propaganda stunts aimed at Western conservatives. The first one is the LGBT propaganda law and the second one is the apparent willingness of the Kremlin to embrace a pro-life position. Such stances obviously infuriated Western leftists, but just like in the 80s, the purpose of Russian cultural subversion is not to infiltrate the left, which almost always falls in line anyway, but to infiltrate the right. In any event, the bellyaching of the left about the treatment of non-straight people in Russia and the cheers of the right about it are both misguided. In reality, from a legal standpoint, non-straights in Russia are treated no better and no worse than they are anywhere else in Eastern Europe or Germany or Finland. That is to say, no gay marriage and no gay adoption, but yes to them serving in the military, yes to them having bars, pride parades and all the rest, which they actually do exist, and just like anywhere else, predominantly in the big cities. Now with that said, like anywhere else, there is the legal or the de jure situation, and then there's the factual or the de facto situation. And it's here where things do get murkier, and indeed Russia is significantly harsher than everyone else in Europe. The oft-cited propaganda law is basically saying that you can't have LGBTist propaganda in schools. Now, no matter how you feel about this, such practice is not exactly new, nor is it specific to Russia. In practice, guidelines with similar end result exist all over Europe, including Germany, Poland, Hungary, and other places that have a general restriction on sexualizing material to be presented to children. Again, with that said, in practice, many areas of Russia do go one step further and use the law as a justification to beat up random gays or to simply be an asshole to the first fag you meet. But that's hardly the fault of the Kremlin, but rather part of the general mentality brought in by the Soviet Union. Now, need I remind you that homosexuality was decriminalized in 1993, but it became a criminal offense to begin with in Russia when the Soviets came to power. It wasn't a criminal offense before that, but I will leave this discussion for a separate video on the anti-gay left. The point I'm trying to make here is that this law is a stunt to allow for the mistaken impression that Russia is cracking down on degeneracy. But it actually doesn't. On most metrics, Russia is degenerate to the core. Same goes with their pro-life stunt. Here's a map with abortions by region in Europe. Notice that most of Eastern Europe isn't particularly great in this aspect. However, notice that the worst in Europe, the dark red, are in the far eastern of Ukraine, Moscow, and the regions nearby St. Petersburg. What do all of these have in common? Well, these are the most Russian culturally homogeneous areas on the face of the earth. They also happen to be the areas with the highest incidence of abortion anywhere in Europe. Considering the facts, one will have to be purposefully ignorant to continue to peddle the narrative that Russia is a big supporter of the family or of the pro-life cause or generally a promoter of conservative Western values. It's just simply not the case. Again, many of these metrics are the way they are because of the fact the history of Russia is significantly different even when compared to the history of other countries in the former Eastern Bloc, let alone those in the former Western Bloc. But nevertheless, you can't preach pro-life as a governmental national project to the world when back home you're the worst offender. In the previous episode, we mentioned the HIV epidemic and the fact that Russia also has one of the fastest growing HIV epidemics in the world, as documented by the Russian press. There are at least 1.2 million people infected with HIV in Russia, and 1.2 million is a very conservative estimate. It's probably closer to 1.5 million, or 1.2% of the national population. And most estimates put the proportion of Russians living with HIV to go as high as 2% by the end of this decade. Now, this may not sound like a lot, but the average in Europe is around 0.4% and dropping. Now, there are a lot of factors that contribute to this, amongst which are the lack of education regarding the topic, the lack of facilities to efficiently treat the infections, but also the generalized societal degeneracy. I mean, yeah, sure, the state can be blamed for lacking a functional program to deal with the HIV epidemic, but the HIV is not an airborne virus. It's transmitted mostly via degenerate behavior most of the time, such as casual unprotected sex, particularly homosexual, sharing the needles amongst junkies, and from infected mothers to their offspring. And while it is true that Russian hospitals are not exactly top-notch first-world facilities, the vast majority of new cases don't come as nosocomial infections, that is to say, infections acquired in a hospital due to staff negligence, but rather as a result of chosen degenerate behavior amongst the populace. Last month, the Russian authorities officially declared an HIV epidemic in the city of Yekaterinburg. Main cause of infection? Drugs. If you remember, Russia made international headlines a few years ago about a new cheap but highly dangerous and addictive drug called crocodile, called that way for the effects that it induces on the addict's skin. This is a drug administered by injection, just like heroin, and it exists as a cheap alternative to the much more known opium-based drug. Needless to say, a significant chunk of the addicts on crocodile end up contracting hepatitis C or HIV, or both. What did the Russian authorities do about this? Well, they banned methadone, which is the main tool rehab facilities use to reduce the consumption of hard drugs amongst the highly advanced cases of addiction. Now, I'm not saying methadone is a great thing, it really isn't, but banning it makes things a lot worse, not just for the addicts, but also for the wider society. Put simply, it is better to have the hopeless cases of rehab facilities hooked on methadone in a controlled environment than to have them on the streets thinking about where they can get the rubles necessary to get their next heroin or worse, crocodile dose. Both choices are bad, but one is worse in terms of negative externalities upon innocent people. Opioid substitution therapy, which is the academic lingo for hooking junkies on methadone and away from heroin and other far worse drugs, is not perfect by any means, but it's cheaper all around and better than the status quo. Mind you, this argument is valid anywhere in the world, not just Russia, but it's Russia that went as far as to ban methadone altogether. Also, in the previous episodes, I mentioned the high degree of alcoholism in the Russian populace. Things are a lot worse than the stats are showing it. Just an hour ago, from when I'm recording this, 49 people died in Irkutsk after drinking bath essence, which they deemed as a good enough substitute for alcohol. They literally drank antifreeze. That is, of course, an extreme case, but it is nowhere near as abnormal in Russia for far too many individuals to drink all sorts of stuff that can appear to substitute alcohol, and the consequences are dire. Russians quite literally drink themselves to death at rates nowhere near as comparable to any other European country. In other countries, when alcoholics can't afford to buy from the official market, they either drink less or ferment fruits and manufacture beverages beneath the radar, or they buy at smaller rates from those that do. In Russia, when alcoholics can't afford the drink, they distill antifreeze and other highly toxic materials. So yeah, that's how things really are, as opposed to what RT will tell you. The problems that absolutely do exist in Europe do not justify Russia worshipping, and the fact that the left went full mental with the Russian hackers' conspiracy theories also does not mean that Russia is actually a fabulous place unfairly maligned by the Western establishment. As bad as most of Europe is, and it is, sadly in way too many aspects, I would still rather live here than in Putin's Russia. And the point of this mini-series is not just to show how bad Russia is, but to also show what are the effects of an almost uninterrupted period of 100 years of dictatorship. Because make no mistake, Russia was better than this, and Russia can be better than this, but not as long as dictatorship survives. Not as long as burning food to make a point is more important than solving deep-rooted problems amongst the Russian people. Not as long as pulling a media stunt is more important than addressing the societal issues that plague the Russian society. None of these can be solved under the current framework, not as long as in the highest echelons of power and increasingly in the science academy persists the belief that condoms are an American imperialist tool to weaken Russia. This is straight out of the Soviet delusion era. Only it's much worse. At least the Soviet regime didn't outright reject hard science, they only rejected basic economics. But this establishment goes far worse than that. And with that said, let the torrent of abuse, cursing and conspiracies flow into the comment section and the downvote brigade. Talk to y'all soon on Freedom Alternative.